Good morning and welcome to our second retreat address on our Lenten journey with St. Mark. If you're watching this, then you've obviously made the decision to come back, and that means that yesterday wasn't too terrible for you. So it's lovely indeed to welcome you back. Yesterday included quite a few introductions and practical points, but from now on we'll move straight in. Yesterday we had a very brief introduction to St. Mark's Gospel, and today we're starting to think about the context of the Gospel of St. Mark. And so I want us just to think a little bit about how when we read the Gospel, we really need to understand a few things. Who, what, why, and when. The context of the Gospel is really important to us. We can only understand it when we know who it was written for, how it was written, why it was written, and when. And so this next talk is a little bit more of a kind of combination of a Bible study and a little bit of history. It is important, though, for us to understand these things if we are to prayerfully embrace the Gospel. We have these things in the back of our mind as we approach the scriptures in prayer. So who wrote it? Well, first of all, it was thought to be very much anonymous, a Christian of the 1st century in the Roman Empire. And then as the 1st century moved on, a scholar with an amazing name, Papias of Hierapolis, but you can't say that, around 70 AD adds the name Mark to it. Now, what we do know about Mark is that Mark was Peter's interpreter. We have a word we use about how we use the gospel, and it's called hermeneutics. When I was at theological college, one of my subjects was to learn hermeneutics. It's not just Bible study, it's about interpretation of the gospel. So we thought a little bit yesterday about what different versions of the Bible, what translations you might use. And there are other Bibles, like, for example, the Living Bible, which I know some of you have used and enjoy using at home. And that is more of a hermeneutic. It's not just a translation of an original text. It is an interpretation of what that text says. So rather than being a straight translation, it's somebody else's opinion, if you want, of how they perceive, albeit prayerfully, the words of Jesus, say, for example, in a parable might be translated, and what those things might mean to us in a modern age. And those Bibles are really a lovely thing to have, but they are quite different to just an ordinary translation. The word hermeneutes actually means interpretation. And so when Papias of Hierapolis, there we go, I've said it a second time, added the name Mark, he understood that Mark was Peter's interpreter. He was his hermeneutes. Mark was not an eyewitness. These were, according to Papias, and then later in the 2nd century to Justin, the martyr, these were memoirs of Peter. This was really Peter's gospel, written down by Mark. Is this Peter's testimony then? Peter's account? It's interesting to think about that, because if we look at the scriptures, Peter keeps coming up, doesn't he, time and time again. Now, some scholars don't like that, and that's fine, and I'm not going to give the definitive answer, because it doesn't take away from the truth of the gospel. But if the gospel is framed by the presence of Peter, then it's framed by a primary witness. So ask yourself, from whose perspective are you viewing events here? Quite often, when we look at the scriptures, it is Peter, isn't it? And in 1 Peter, Peter himself refers to my son Mark. What about the question, where and for whom was it written? Well, we can tell that Mark was writing for Gentiles. How do we know that? Because if you look at the Gospel, he starts to explain Jewish customs. For example, washing before meals. He also translates some of those Aramaic words we were thinking about yesterday. He does not expect his readers to know these words or to understand these customs. And there are Latin expressions too in Rome which are explained. So who, where, when is the next question? Well, probably between AD 66 and 70, which are the years that Rome was under siege. Matthew and Luke are probably written at least a decade later. The end of the reign of the Emperor Nero, Christians were being persecuted, and people thought the world as they knew it was going to come to an end. If you look at chapter 13 of Mark's Gospel, it's got quite an apocalyptic feel, a word which means about the end of time. You often hear that, don't you, that word apocalypse. It's what it's about, it's what it means. And if you look at chapter 13, I know you've probably not got there yet, if you're reading through just 3 or 4 chapters each day of the 16, but you will come to see that there is an urgency there. We thought about that in our first talk, about the sort of gospel it was. Why the urgency? Because the people for whom it was written possibly thought that the end of the age was about to come. There was an urgency. We don't need fancy language. We don't need scholarship here. Let's just get the message out before it's too late, so that people may be won for Christ, the good news of the gospel. So there is a context here of persecution, and it's really important that we understand that. We get hints in the parable of the sower of the trials that are coming, hostility, persecution, suffering. So it's a tough gospel for a tough world. And is that why it's centred on the cross of Jesus? Somebody once described it, and I can't remember who, but as a passion narrative with an extended introduction. Matthew doesn't have lots of the lovely Mark doesn't have lots of the lovely stories of Jesus being born and the incarnation, and all of that is straight in. But it's all in the light of the cross. It is really a gospel of the passion, which makes it even more wonderful for us to be looking at it in this mid part of Lent as we start to move towards Passiontide next Sunday. It's a gospel of realism, which talks about the power of realism. It's a time of fear, a time of political turmoil, and a time of panic. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because right now, here in 2021, we have lots of fear, we have lots of worry and panic all around us, with an international worldwide pandemic. As we look round the world, as we read the news and see what's happening, even this week, looking at the news, we're seeing places where military coups have taken place. There are power struggles, there is fear, political unrest and turmoil. And even in these last few days, we've seen the turmoil of protesters who are in London, feeling so moved by their own cause for the protection of women's safety that they were prepared to break rules and come together in order to express their own fears and anxieties. So this gospel, written for one generation who knew fear of political turmoil and panic, is just as relevant as it ever was. And we could say the same of every generation in which this gospel has been read. And where does Mark take us? In this situation, straight to the cross. No messing about. Like the disciples, we don't always want to go there, do we? But sometimes, as I reflected on my Lent in the Wilderness introduction to Lent that we shared together at the start of this holy season in our churches, we might not want to go there, but sometimes we find ourselves there whether we want to be there or not. We just end up there. My Cistercian community to which I belong follows the rule of St. Benedict, and we read a little portion of that every day in our common life together, although we are a dispersed community. And we are reminded in our reading through of the rule, which we get through 3 times in the year. We read a little a portion every day and share that with Cistercians and Benedictines throughout the world. It's an agreed apportionment. But one of the most powerful things that St. Benedict reminded his first monks was that we must share in the suffering of Christ if we are to share in the joy of the resurrection life. And Mark's gospel takes us absolutely straight, without any messing, to the crux. He takes us to the cross. You can give me the joy of St. Luke, the wisdom of St. Matthew, and the mysticism of St. John. Those are for other Lent retreats maybe, but at this time we think about the way that Mark very simply keeps us sober and real. If this is Peter's gospel, which Mark has written down, then we remember that Peter denied our Lord and yet also knew the joy of being raised up, the power and liberation that even being somebody who denied Jesus would not keep the love of God from him. This reality is really good news for us. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. God bless.